Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 265 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Well, buckle your seatbelt, because this is the episode I know a lot of listeners have been waiting for a long time. A detailed analysis of the new 7mm Precision Rifle Cartridge from Hornady. Hornady made a gigantic splash when they announced the brand new 7mm Precision Rifle Cartridge in late 2022. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen as much excitement surrounding a new cartridge as was the case with the 7mm PRC. While many hunters and shooters were overjoyed with the introduction of the new cartridge, others were skeptical about the need for yet another new round. This was especially true considering the ongoing ammunition shortage at the time. I will admit that I was initially unconvinced about the touted benefits of the 7mm PRC. However, I was pleasantly surprised by what I learned when I looked at the new cartridge in detail. So in this episode, I'm going to discuss the history as well as the strengths and weaknesses of the 7mm PRC in detail. I'll also provide some information on how that cartridge compares to the other cartridges in Hornady's Precision Rifle Cartridge family with the 6.5 PRC and the 300 PRC to give you an idea of what sort of performance you can expect from the 7 PRC and so you can decide if it fits your needs as a hunter. Now, before we get started, make sure you're on my email list. To do that, click the link in the episode description or go to huntingguns101.com and sign up for my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. You'll get my free ebook when you do that, plus you'll also receive the emails I send out every weekday. Those are entertaining and informative emails about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. I get feedback all the time from people telling me how much they enjoy receiving them and how much they look forward to hearing from me every day. So make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com and signing up, or by clicking that link in the description. Okay, let's get started talking about the 7 PRC. And to do that, let's rewind the clock just a couple months and go back to when I was in Africa hunting with this new cartridge. The blue wildebeest bull almost looked bored as he turned his head to look at me. After staring at me for a couple of seconds, he flicked his tail, slowly turned his head away from me, and then reached down to take another mouthful of food. This was a very nice bull, and he was only about 80 yards away. But daylight was fading fast, and I did not have much time remaining to take a shot. Fortunately, the bull was calm as could be, and perhaps he felt secure in the growing darkness. Knowing it was now or never, I waited for him to turn his head again, took aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. My Christensen Arms Ridgeline FFT, chambered in 7mm PRC, barked and sent a 160-grain CX bullet straight into that wildebeest. He dropped instantly at the shot and never even twitched afterwards. I also ended up taking a nice Impala on that hunt with the same rifle and ammunition, with good results there as well. Now, I'm sure that was not the first blue wildebeest or the first Impala taken with the new 7mm PRC or even the new 160-grain CX bullet. But there were probably only a handful of other hunters who had done so at that point. Even so, I was quite impressed with the performance of that cartridge, and so were the other hunters and professional hunters in camp with me at the time. So that's all well and good, but there are plenty of other cartridges capable of cleanly bringing down a blue wildebeest or an Impala. What's all the hubbub about with the 7 PRC? Is it the real deal, or will it just be another flash in the pan that's all hype for a couple of years before disappearing completely? Well, let's rewind a couple of years and go back to the introduction of the Precision Rifle Cartridge family to help answer this question. Now, extra long-range shooting and Precision Rifle Series competitions, or PRS competitions, had become really popular during the first and second decades of the 21st century. With that in mind, rifle and ammunition manufacturers look for different ways to serve those markets. Now, while they were initially developed independently to satisfy very different needs, Hornady released the 6.5 PRC and the 300 PRC around the same time a few years ago. Both cartridges were somewhat closely related, though, and incorporated many of the same design features. Among other things, they had a long head height, a long case neck, a relatively fast rifling twist rate, and some specific chamber design features to enhance accuracy. Now, those cartridges both used modified 375 Ruger cartridge cases. Now, the 375 Ruger is designed with the same .532-inch case head diameter as the 375 H&H. However, unlike the 375 H&H, the 375 Ruger is a beltless cartridge with minimal taper, so the actual body of the 375 Ruger is larger in diameter than is the case with the 375 H&H. This results in a slight increase in case capacity for the 375 Ruger and all cartridges descended from it, but it still works with a standard Magnum bolt face. Now, head height is the amount of space available for the bullet outside the case while still staying within the SAAMI specifications for the cartridge. Put simply, more head height facilitates the use of a very long aerodynamic bullet without requiring that projectile to be seated so deeply into the case that it intrudes into the powder column, and without requiring it to be seated so far outside the case that it is longer than the maximum SAAMI length of the cartridge. Now, in that same vein, rifles chambered in the Precision Rifle Cartridges typically have a fast rifling twist rate, and it's usually about 1 in 8 inches. And this is in order to stabilize those long, heavy, high BC bullets. They're also built with a long enough neck to provide adequate neck tension with those long bullets, and this can also help with accuracy. Those cartridges also have a relatively quote-unquote tight freebore diameter. Now, freebore is the smooth portion of a rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Now, having a more snug freebore diameter means there's less room for the for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. This can also help enhance accuracy. Now, the end result was both the 6.5 and the 300 PRC were optimized to accurately shoot long, sleek, high BC bullets at Magnum velocities. Well, the success of those two cartridges had many in the shooting community clamoring for a 7mm PRC to fill the gap between the little 6.5 PRC on one end and the much larger 300 PRC on the other end. Well, they got what they asked for when Hornady received formal SAAMI certification for the 7mm PRC in 2022, and then the company formally and officially announced the new cartridge to the world later that year. Now, the 7mm PRC incorporates all those same design features I just mentioned with the 6.5 and the 300 PRC, and it neatly fills the gap in performance between its smaller and larger brothers. Typical 7mm PRC ballistics are a 175 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second, 3,496 foot-pounds of energy, or a 180 grain bullet at 2,950 feet per second for 3,477 foot-pounds of energy. Now, both loads use long, aerodynamic, heavy for caliber bullets that minimize bullet drop and wind deflection at extended range. Additionally, it's also worth noting that the 7mm PRC is optimized for use with a 24-inch barrel instead of the 26-inch barrels more common with some other Magnum cartridges. Now, it's only natural to wonder how the 7mm PRC stacks up to its siblings in the Precision Rifle Cartridge family. So first, the 6.5 PRC is designed to fit in a short-action rifle. The 7mm PRC is designed to fit in a standard long-action rifle, same length as a 30-06, and the 300 PRC is designed to fit in a longer Magnum-length rifle action. The three cartridges use different bore sizes as well. The 6.5 PRC uses .264 caliber bullets, the 7 PRC uses .284 caliber bullets, and the 300 PRC uses .308 caliber bullets. Now, while the 6.5 PRC can use lighter 120, 127, and 130 grain bullets, heavier 140, 143, or 147 grain bullets are also popular with that cartridge as well. The 7 PRC most often uses bullets in the 160 to 180 grain range, and at this instant, 160, 175, and 180 grain bullets are the most common. Now finally, though the 300 PRC can certainly use lighter 30 cal bullets, it's most commonly available with either 190 grain, 212 grain, or 225 grain bullets in factory loadings. And hand loaders have even used bullets weighing up to 250 grains in that cartridge with success too. Now, since it is designed for use in Magnum-length rifle actions, the 300 PRC has the longest maximum overall length of 3.7 inches. Also has the longest case length of 2.58 inches. The 7 PRC has a maximum overall length of 3.34 inches and a case length of 2.28 inches. The 6.5 PRC, which is the smallest of the bunch, has a maximum overall length of 2.955 inches and a case length of 2.03 inches. Now, since they are all descended from the 375 Ruger, all three cartridges have the same .532-inch rim diameter and use that same beltless case design. And they all also have a 30-degree shoulder. With all that in mind, shouldn't be surprising, the 300 PRC has the largest case capacity, followed by the 7 PRC and then the 6.5 PRC. And they are all have the same SAMI maximum pressure of 65,000 PSI. Even so, those differences in their external dimensions translate into some interesting differences in their ballistic performance. So this is apparent when you compare Hornady Outfitter and Precision Hunter factory ammo in 6.5 PRC loaded with their 130 grain CX with a .489 BC and 143 grain ELDX with a .625 BC. Then in 7 PRC, those same loads use 160 grain CX with a .596 BC and the 175 grain ELDX with a .689 BC. And then in the 300 PRC, in those loadings uses 190 grain CX with a .575 BC and the 212 grain ELDX with a .663 BC. Now note that in each case, the 7mm PRC has the highest BC bullets of in each class, right? The 160 grain CX has a higher BC than the 190 and the 130 grain CX. Same thing with that 175 grain ELDX. Now, the CX is a lead-free monolithic projectile designed by Hornady to deliver high weight retention and deep penetration. However, since it is a monolithic projectile, those bullets don't have nearly as high of a BC as the ELDX projectiles do, which have a lead core. Additionally, while the ELDX is designed to expand at velocities as low as 1,350 feet per second, the CX requires a much faster impact velocity of at least 2,000 feet per second. Okay, let's be clear up front. All three cartridges are well-designed, flat-shooting cartridges that do pretty well in the wind. So this is an exercise in splitting hairs here to a certain degree, but the results are still interesting and noteworthy in some respects. Interestingly, the 7mm PRC, ELDX, and CX loads are actually the two flattest shooting loads of this bunch. That really says something when a monometal projectile like that 160 grain CX is shooting flatter than lead core projectiles in other high-performance cartridges. This is due to the fact that the 7mm PRC has a higher muzzle velocity than either the 6.5 PRC or the 300 PRC, combined with the fact that the 7mm PRC bullets are so aerodynamic. That 175 grain ELDX has the highest BC of anything in this comparison, and while the 160 grain CX has a lower BC than any of the ELDX bullets here, the still relatively high BC of that bullet combined with its high muzzle velocity gives it a very flat trajectory, second only to that ELDX load for the 7 PRC. Now, as a quick aside, while changes to ballistic coefficient and muzzle velocity both affect trajectory, small increases in muzzle velocity will result in a flatter trajectory than a small increase in ballistic coefficient if everything else is held the same. The opposite is true with wind resistance, though, and we'll talk more about this in a minute. So that increase in muzzle velocity, is what explains the stunningly flat trajectory of the 7 PRC compared to the 6.5 and the 300 PRC here. However, all of these loadings are relatively flat shooting, and just 4.5 inches separates the flattest shooting load from the most arcing load at 500 yards. Not surprisingly, the 300 PRC has more muzzle energy across the board than the 7 PRC and the 6.5 PRC. Even so, the 7mm PRC does pretty well here, and both loads for that cartridge carry over 1,800 foot-pounds of kinetic energy out past 500 yards, and over 2,100 foot-pounds of energy in the case of that ELDX loading. When compared to the 6.5 PRC, the various 7mm loads have about 15 to 37% more muzzle energy and about 12 to 70% more retained energy at 500 yards. Now, interestingly, that 160 grain CX 7mm PRC load actually has a very similar trajectory to the 143 grain ELDX load for the 6.5 PRC. That ELDX bullet has a little bit higher BC than the CX here, but that 160 grain CX starts out going a little faster. They track very closely, and then the 6.5 PRC load has just 0.6 inches more bullet drop at 500 yards. On the other hand, the various 300 PRC loads have 9 to 20% more muzzle energy than the 7 PRC. The 212 ELDX loading for the 300 has 7 to 27% more muzzle energy than the 7 PRC loadings at 500 yards. However, the 175 grain ELDX loading for the 7 PRC actually catches that 190 grain CX loading for the 300 PRC around 400 yards in terms of kinetic energy, and it actually has about 2% more kinetic energy at 500 yards than that 300 PRC load, since it uses a much more aerodynamic bullet. Now, at the same time, the 300 PRC is significantly more powerful than the 6.5 here, and it has 36 to 50% more muzzle energy and 30 to 82% more retained energy than the 6.5 at 500 yards. Additionally, all the loads in this comparison easily maintain at least 1,000 foot-pounds of energy out past 500 yards. Everything but that 130 grain CX load for the 6.5 has at least 1,500 foot-pounds of energy at that range, and the 7mm ELDX load and both 300 PRC loads maintain over 2,000 foot-pounds of energy past 500 yards. Now, once again, the 7mm PRC still has the flattest trajectory of the bunch, and it still outperforms the 6.5 PRC in the kinetic energy department. Interestingly, that 175 grain ELDX loading for the 7 PRC has nearly the same amount of kinetic energy remaining at 1,000 yards as that 212 grain ELDX load for the 300 PRC. And once again, that's because that 175 ELDX has the highest BC of all the bullets in this comparison, which allows it to retain energy and velocity better than anything else. For that reason, that particular 7mm PRC loading actually travels the farthest before dipping below its minimum recommended impact velocity of 1,350 feet per second at a staggering 1,480 yards, as well as before finally going subsonic out at 1,850 yards. All right, now let's talk about another important factor, the wind. These same general trends hold true with regards to wind deflection as well, but with an important caveat. So the 7 PRC ELDX load has the least wind deflection, followed by the 300 PRC ELDX load, then the 6.5 ELDX load, then the 7 PRC CX load, then the 300 CX load, then finally the 6.5 CX. While all of these loads, but to a lesser extent with the 130 grain CX, are pretty darn good in the wind, that 175 grain ELDX load for the 7 PRC is really starting to stand apart from the others here. Indeed, that 1.4 inches of difference in wind deflection between the 175 ELDX and the 212 ELDX might not sound like a tremendous amount, but that's still a 12% advantage in favor of the 7 PRC. Now, as a quick aside, less than 1 foot of wind deflection at 500 yards with a 10 mile an hour full value wind is outstanding. 11.6 inches of wind deflection under those conditions for the 7 PRC compares favorably to the 13.2 inches of wind deflection for the 7 Rim Mag, 14.7 inches of wind deflection for the 300 Win Mag, 15.1 inches of wind deflection for the 6.5 Creedmoor, and 17 inches for the 30-06 when each of those cartridges are using their respective ELDX bullet that Hornady loads in a factory load. All right, that's one of the highest BC bullets available in a factory loading for each cartridge. So it's about as good as it's going to get in the wind for each of those, with maybe some exceptions here or there with a one-off deal. But that difference is going to get even more stark when you compare, say, that 7mm PRC ELDX loading to something like a 30-06 core lock. Then it's really going to blow it out of the water. Now, the mighty 28 Nosler comes very, very close to equaling the 7 PRC in this area with 175 grain Nosler Accubon long range, but it does so while burning a lot more powder and generating a lot more recoil. We'll talk more about the efficiency of the 7 PRC here shortly, but realize that is another advantage of this cartridge. Now, back to our comparison of the PRCs. Once again, these differences in performance in the wind become even more apparent at longer range. For instance, that 175 grain ELDX has about 7 inches of wind deflection than compared to the 212 ELDX, and about 8 inches less wind deflection than the 143 grain ELDX at 1,000 yards. Now, like I said, this is an area where all 3 PRCs really shine with their very high BC bullets, and all of them typically perform a lot better than most comparable loadings and other cartridges at extended range. However, a hunter or shooter looking for a little bit of an advantage here would be well served to look at the 175 grain ELDX load for the 7PRC here. Now, like I mentioned earlier, while those CX loadings seem to hold their own in terms of energy and trajectory, the ELDX loading for each cartridge really leave them in the dust with wind deflection due to their much higher BC. Like I mentioned earlier, velocity is more important than a small change in BC in terms of trajectory, but the opposite is true with wind deflection. And really high BC bullets really perform well in the wind, especially when you combine them with a high velocity, like is the case with all of these cartridges, but especially the 7PRC. All right, now let's talk about recoil. When you compare the recoil produced by hand loads, very similar to the Hornady Precision Hunter loads for the 6.5, 7, and 300 PRC, when fired from identical weight rifles, the results really aren't surprising. The 7 PRC fits neatly between the 6.5 and the 300 PRC in terms of recoil. It has about 53% more recoil than the 6.5 PRC and about 25% less than the 300 PRC. And the 300 PRC has about twice as much recoil as the 6.5 PRC. Now, though the 300 PRC is likely delivering recoil that's towards the upper end of what many hunters can handle, we're still not talking about ridiculous amounts of recoil here, like a 4.58 lot or something like that. It's a lot, but it's not terrible. With a good rifle, you should be able to handle it. But the 7 PRC is a very, very shootable cartridge, and the 6.5 PRC has a even more mild, very easy to control recoil. For reference, the 6.5 PRC has had just a little bit more recoil than the light-kicking 6.5 Creedmoor, and my 7 PRC has noticeably less recoil than typical 300 Win Mag loads, and just maybe a little bit more recoil than the 7 Rim Mag. Now, this is the sort of recoil range that a lot of people can handle without much trouble, especially when you have a rifle that fits you well, you got a good recoil pad on it, or maybe you have a muzzle brake or a suppressor. Even so, and as shootable as the 7 PRC is, it is worth noting that it does kick quite a bit more than the 6.5 PRC. And then the 300 PRC has a lot more recoil than either one. All right, let's talk about a couple of other factors that are also worth discussing. So first, the 300 PRC uses larger diameter bullets than the 7 PRC, which in turn uses larger bullets than the 6.5. Now, those larger diameter 308 caliber bullets used by the 300 PRC have about 18% more frontal surface area than those used by the 7 PRC. And they have about 36% more frontal surface area than those used by the 6.5 PRC. Now, at the same time, those 284 caliber bullets used by the 7 PRC have about 15% more frontal surface area than those used by the 6.5. So all other things being equal, a bigger bullet will make a bigger hole, cause more tissue damage, and result in more blood loss. That's a definite advantage in favor of the 300 PRC, and a smaller, though still significant advantage in favor of the 7 PRC over the 6.5. Now, additionally, those new, heavy, and extremely aerodynamic 284 caliber bullets used by the 7 PRC also have a relatively high ballistic coefficient. Like I mentioned earlier, of all the bullets used in this comparison, the 7 PRC has the highest BC in each category. 175 grain ELDX bullet has a ridiculous BC of 0.689. And even that 160 grain CX, which is a monolithic bullet, has a G1 BC of 0.596. And that is very, very rare for a monometal bullet to cross or even approach that 600 BC threshold. So both of them those are very aerodynamic, high BC loadings. And while the other ones do use high BC bullets themselves, right, that 143 grain ELDX with a 0.625 BC and the 212 ELDX for the 300 with a 0.663 BC, those are nothing to turn your nose up. Those are very aerodynamic bullets too, but 0.689 is better, and then that 0.596 BC for the 160 grain CX is better than the 0.575 BC for the 190 grain CX, and significantly better than the 0.489 BC for the 130 grain CX. And then, of course, the comparison is even more stark when you're looking at other types of bullets that are not as highly engineered to be real sleek and aerodynamic, like the CX in the monolithic bullet class or the ELDX bullets in the lead core bullets. Regardless of what comparison you're making here, a very high BC bullet is going to retain energy and velocity much better than is the case with a bullet with a lower BC. And that is one of those reasons why that 7PRC just does so darn well in these comparisons. You combine that high initial muzzle velocity with a really sleek aerodynamic bullet that holds on to that velocity better than many of the competitors, then that turns into a flat trajectory, lots of retained energy downrange, and then really good wind deflection. That performance in the wind is especially important because if you have a good range to your target, it's just a simple matter of getting your holdovers right or dialing your scope appropriately. But dealing with wind is very, very tricky. Estimating wind is hard. Estimating the exact angle the wind is coming at is very, very hard. And a very high BC bullet that really resists wind deflection well is going to make it more forgiving of range, wind speed, or wind direction estimation errors, and you can make a little bit of an error, and it's not going to make as much of a difference with that high BC bullet compared to one that is not as good in the wind. So that is just a deadly, deadly combination of factors there that we have with this 7PRC. In that same vein, let's talk a little bit about accuracy. Now, external ballistics are extremely important, but performance on paper doesn't mean a darn thing if you can't hit your target. Like I mentioned earlier, Hornady implemented some design principles with the 6.5, 7, and 300 PRC to help optimize accuracy. And specifically, I'm talking about the fact that they built the cartridge with a tight free bore diameter. Like I said, free bore is the smooth portion of the rifle barrel closest to the cartridge. Having a more snug free bore diameter means there's less room for the bullet to yaw upon firing before engaging the rifling. So this can help enhance accuracy, especially with extremely long bullets. So the designers at Hornady built all the Precision Rifle cartridges with a tight free bore diameter in the same manner that they did with the 6.5 Creedmoor, and then the same thing with what Winchester did with the new 6.8 Western cartridge. Now, exact details will vary depending on the rifle, ammo, and shooter in question that we're looking at here, but I will say that the 3 Precision Rifle cartridges have some of the best potential for accuracy available today using factory rifles and off-the-shelf ammunition. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about availability of rifles and ammo in those 3 cartridges. Hornady raised a few eyebrows when they released the 7PRC in the middle of a historic shortage of ammunition and firearms. Now, while some hunters and shooters reacted to that announcement with frustration that Hornady was developing resources, or rather devoting resources, to producing 7PRC ammo at the expense of other, more popular, older cartridges that were still in short supply, I will say the anger didn't seem to be as extreme as what I saw witnessed with other cartridge introductions around that time, like the 6.8 Western. Now, part of this was due to the fact that Hornady released the 7PRC over a year after Winchester rolled out the 6.8 Western, and things were better with the ammo shortage. They still weren't great, but they were better than they were a year earlier. In any case, it seems like, at least where I'm looking, 7PRC rifles and ammo are surprisingly easy to find right now. That's not to say they're under every rock and behind every tree, but I didn't have any trouble just going out and purchasing that new Christensen Arms Ridgeline FFT. And it's a left-handed model of that rifle too. And I've had no problem finding ammo to feed that rifle just through normal channels. The good news is that from the get-go, Hornady seemed to do a good job of making a couple of different lines of ammo, and we'll talk more about that here in a second, to fit different needs, and working with different rifle manufacturers to make sure that there was a good supply of rifles of varying price points and quality levels available for people to buy straight from the get-go. And so this was a case where, there was a lot of hype and excitement surrounding the cartridge when it came out. But at the same time, there were rifles that you could go and buy from different companies, and the same thing with factory ammo. They, it seemed like they really did their homework and their preparation ahead of time, making sure there was a good amount of stuff in the pipeline ready to go for people to buy rifles and ammo. And the same thing with reloading components. They're selling reloading components for it now, and there's reloading data available online. And so, like I said, their prep work was clearly good in this case. Now, at this instant, Hornady is the only company that manufactures factory 7PRC ammo. And they currently offer 3 loads for the cartridge, an offering in their match line loaded with a 180 grain ELD match bullet, an offering in their outfitter line with a 160 grain CX bullet, and an offering in their Precision Hunter line with a 175 grain ELDX bullet. Now, that match offering is specifically intended for competition shooters who want an incredibly accurate and flat shooting load for banging steel or punching paper at extended range. But those match bullets are not designed for optimum performance on game, and Hornady does not recommend those bullets for hunting. So for the hunters, you should instead, I think, look at the Outfitter and Precision Hunter 7mm PRC loads, both of which are excellent for hunting all manner of game in North America and elsewhere in the world. Now, additionally, 7 PRC ammo prospects are looking good in the near future, too. So, for instance, Federal has announced that they will be adding that cartridge to their Terminal Ascent line very soon. And there are also rumblings that companies like maybe Remington and some others are going to pick up that cartridge soon as well. Now, the same thing is true for a couple of different rifle manufacturers. Among other rifle manufacturers, Christensen Arms, Fierce Firearms, GA Precision, Gunworks, Hill Country Rifles, Mossberg, Proof Research, Remington, Ruger, Savage Arms, Seekins Precision, and Springfield Armory all produce 7mm PRC rifles, and that list of rifles is probably going to grow in the near future as well. Now, you probably noticed the very wide array of different companies that are making rifles in this cartridge. This ranges from Mossberg, where you can get a Mossberg Patriot in 7 PRC for a surprisingly reasonable price, all the way up to multi-$1,000 custom and semi-custom rifles that are just very, very high-end stuff. And you got everything in between there as well. Now, you probably noticed there are some notable companies that are absent from that list right now, but it's still a really good start right out the gate, and hopefully that list of manufacturers will continue to grow. Now, I mentioned previously I have a Christensen Arms Ridgeline FFT in that cartridge. I think it's fantastic. They make a regular Christensen Arms Ridgeline in that chambering. They make the FFT in that chambering, which is lighter, and then they make an FFT titanium, which is still even lighter than that. Now, mine's just the regular FFT, has a 22-inch barrel, and I think that's a really good balance of being long enough to deliver good velocity without being too big or bulky. Plus, even though this is just the regular FFT, this thing is still a light with a capital L. Mine tips the scales at just over 7 pounds, fully loaded, and wearing a Leupold VX5 HD scope. And so you could get under 7 pounds, no problem with that, putting a smaller and lighter scope on it, and get even lighter with that titanium version of it if you so wanted, with just a factory off-the-shelf rifle, and it shoots just lights out. That's what I took to Africa, and it performed wonderfully. Now, there is no guarantee what the future may hold, but at least in that near term, things seem to be doing a lot better with the ammo shortage here in the U.S. With that in mind, ammo and rifles in 6.5 and 300 PRC do seem to be more available than those in 7 PRC right now. So we'll see what the future holds. Like I said, right now, 7 PRC is not hard to find, but 6.5 and 300 are easier. But that may end up changing in the next couple of years if that cartridge continues to explode in popularity. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if that is indeed what happened, if the 7 PRC catches or even surpasses those other two very soon. All right, so where do we stand overall with these 3 cartridges? The 7 PRC fires larger, heavier, and usually more aerodynamic bullets at a slightly faster velocity than the 6.5 PRC. The 6.5 PRC has a slight edge in terms of recoil, but the 7mm PRC has a flatter trajectory, less wind deflection, and has more kinetic energy at typical hunting ranges, and it's just better for hunting bigger game since it uses larger caliber, heavier bullets that retain more energy. Both cartridges have similar trajectories and similar amounts of wind deflection. In fact, both are excellent performers in that category overall when compared to many other commonly used centerfire rifle cartridges. So those are both good choices for someone that wants to squeeze all the performance they can out of a cartridge, and that's especially true for that short-action 6.5 PRC. Now, the 7 PRC does have more recoil, but remember, it outperforms the 6.5 PRC to one degree or another, and I think the 6.5 is already an excellent performer in many areas, but the 7 is better in terms of trajectory and resistance to wind drift, though. Plus, the 7 PRC uses heavier, larger diameter bullets that have noticeably more kinetic energy at typical hunting ranges. That might not matter that much when hunting sheep, deer, pronghorn, but I would definitely lean towards the 7mm PRC over the 6.5 PRC for game like bear, elk, or moose. On the other hand, that little short-action 6.5 PRC would be my choice for a mountain hunt where a very lightweight and easy-to-carry rifle is preferable. That's not to say the 7 PRC would be bad in this area, because I think it'd still be excellent, but I think the 6.5 PRC would be better. All right, what about the 300 PRC versus the 7mm PRC? Now, the 300 PRC fires heavier, larger diameter bullets at a slightly slower velocity than the 7mm PRC. The 7 PRC generally uses more aerodynamic bullets, though. So with all that in mind, the 300 PRC has an edge with kinetic energy at most ranges, not all, but most, but it also has more recoil. And the 7 PRC does have an advantage with trajectory and wind deflection, though. Now, the fact that the 300 PRC can use heavier, larger diameter bullets really catapults it into that next level for work at extended range and or for hunting bigger game like elk and moose. I've heard people jokingly say that the 300 PRC is the next best thing to calling in an airstrike on a game animal. That's an exaggeration, but not a gigantic one. I mean, remember, we're pushing 4,000 foot-pounds of energy with that thing at the muzzles. I mean, it is a beast. But the 7mm PRC is no slouch at all, though, and it holds its own versus the 300 PRC in many areas. Plus, it has a lot less recoil, and it's available in a long-action rifle instead of that longer Magnum action that the larger 300 PRC requires. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier with the efficiency of the 7 PRC. The fact that it can outperform the 300 PRC in certain areas and nip right at its heels in others while producing less recoil and still fitting in a standard linked rifle action says a lot about how well designed and efficient the 7 PRC is. But the extra power of the 300 PRC is nice to have sometimes. If we're being honest, though, most hunters aren't going to need that extra capability the 300 PRC provides compared to the 7. However, that extra power is nice for those that really want or just need it. For most people, I would say the 7 PRC is a better fit. As we wrap up, to paraphrase that quote from The Princess Bride, just like how you should never get involved in a land war in Asia or go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line, you should never bet against the design and marketing teams at Hornady. They know how to design high-performing cartridges, how to build effective factory ammunition, and how to promote those products like no other company in the world today. I think they hit it out of the park with the 7mm Precision Rifle Cartridge. And I think this is a good example of combining an A-plus product with A-plus marketing that results in this sort of unprecedented enthusiasm surrounding the cartridge right now. So it sounds like a lot of other people agree with me. Marketing and hype aside, the new cartridge does provide a significant benefit to hunters, especially for those heading out west for bigger game, like elk, where distances can get pretty long sometimes. I don't know of another cartridge that offers the superb balance of a flat trajectory, great resistance to wind deflection, surprisingly moderate recoil, and excellent retained energy at extended range that the 7mm PRC provides. Plus, the accuracy potential for the cartridge is outstanding, even for those using off-the-shelf rifles and factory ammunition. The 6.5 Creedmoor gets a lot of, largely, but not completely undeserved, in my opinion, hate for being underpowered. However, even those who dislike the cartridge usually still give it high marks for accuracy. Well, the 7mm PRC seems to have accuracy potential on par with the 6.5 Creedmoor, while at the same time providing a really big step up in power. Of all the rifles I've ever owned, my Bergara 6.5 Creedmoor is the easiest to shoot accurately. My Christensen Arms Ridgeline in 7mm PRC is number 2, if that says anything. I'm not necessarily encouraging anyone to go out and use the 7 PRC for any extreme long-range hunting scenario. That said, I do think it is a better choice for those who want to reach out a bit than other highly regarded favorites for that sort of work, like the 7mm Rim Mag and the 300 Win Mag. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the 7mm PRC to the average eastern whitetail hunter who never plans on hunting anywhere else, but I think the 7mm PRC would be the perfect cartridge for someone looking for an ideal, all-around rifle cartridge for use on a wide range of game like mule deer, black bear, pronghorn, elk, moose, African plains game, etc. There's no guarantee what the future may hold, but I think the future is looking bright for the 7mm PRC. Now, as usual, I have written a really detailed article about this cartridge for the Big Game Hunting blog, and I will be sure to put a link to that article in the show notes if you want to check it out. Now, if you're new here, please make sure you subscribe to this show to make sure that you receive all of my future episodes automatically. Now, next, I talk about Hunting Guns 101 all the time in these cartridge comparisons and profiles. If you enjoyed these episodes, I think you will love Hunting Guns 101 because it's full of the same sort of information contained in these episodes, and you'll also get access to a level of detail and analysis I don't get into during the podcast, like, among other things, more specific recommendations for rifles I recommend in various cartridge, the specific situations I think they're best suited for, the ammo I think is best suited for those situations, etc., and why. So if you want more of this, subscribe to Hunting Guns 101. I guarantee you'll learn lots of useful information about practical ballistics and firearms in general in that training that will help you be more successful afield and fill more tags on your hunts. It's a great investment in your education and training that will pay off for decades to come. Click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com/form, F-O-R-M, and fill out the order form to sign up and get instant access today. That's huntingguns101.com/form. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and I can help. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.